lovely and darling viewers, it's Jen here at Check Her Joy, and this time I'm reviewing Candide by Voltaire. This is a philosophical satire adventure story that was written in 1751, and it follows the main character of Candide as a series of misadventures happen to him that take him across Europe and into South America and back to Europe and eventually to Turkey. And just all kinds of really awful things happen to him, but the entire time Candide is thinking about philosophy, and he really believes what he's been taught, that everything happens for the best and that we're living in the best possible world. Even though everybody gets raped and murdered and sold into slavery and physically abused, cannibalism, although even all those things happen and exist and happen to characters in this book, we're still living in like the best possible world, guys. Believe me. It is really funny and hysterical and ridiculous. This particular edition of the book is translated by Lowell Bair. It was originally written in French. And the art is by Sheilah Beckett. And to kind of give you an idea of how this book goes, there were like 2 pictures in here that I could possibly show you on YouTube because otherwise they had bare breasts. So there's a lot of sex and kind of raunchiness in here without ever being too explicit, because this is also a very quick, fast-paced, episodic story where we're kind of just like alluded to the fact that characters were having sex, and being prostitutes and being raped. So, yay! Honestly, I did mostly enjoy this book. It's really short. It's only about 100 pages. The first 50 of them I found hilarious, and then somewhere around that middle section, it started getting repetitive, and I kind of didn't really enjoy it as much, to the point that by the end of the book, it felt kind of depressing, because nothing really matters, because life's just gonna happen anyway. I don't want to get too much into all of the things that happen to Candide and his friends, but the basic plot of the story is that Candide has grown up living in this castle, and he's pretty well off. He is living with his uncle, and it's a pretty good life. Everything's great. He is in love with, I think, his cousin, but the lady Cunegande, who from now on I am just going to call Lady because I don't know how to pronounce that properly. Anyway, Candide is in love with his fair and beautiful lady, who pretty much every character in this book, if they're not related to her, is kind of in love with. Candide gets caught kissing her, and her dad completely freaks out and kicks him out of the castle, and this sets Candide off on his series of misadventures, which are pretty episodic and really short. So, like, there's a chapter where one thing happens, and the beginning of the chapter pretty much tells you what's going to happen, so that's not a huge surprise. But some of them, like chapter 6 here, is only a page long. Some of them are like 3 pages at most. They are really short, quick adventures. I think part of the problem with this book is that we go through stuff so fast that you can't really process anything. It's just like, this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. I'd really have to like take it slowly and break it down to really truly get into it. So we're basically getting an overview of Candide's crazy adventures, which literally go everywhere. One of the first things that happens to him is that he joins the army, kind of by accident, without meaning to, and just everything about being in the army goes badly. He does really poorly at learning his drills at first, and then once he does conquer them, then he gets in trouble for something else, which eventually leads him to being beaten by every single member of the regiment a total of 36 times, to the point that Candide is like, can you just shoot me now, please? So lots of torture and abuse in this book. We see him fleeing at one point to the city of Lisbon, where there is an earthquake, a tsunami, which starts a fire and ends up with no food, and a third of the population of the city being, I think it's a third of the population is left, or a third of the population dies. Anyway, there's a ton of death. But even despite all of that stuff happening, Candide still thinks that he is in the best possible world with the best possible stuff that could be happening to him. Which is where the humor comes from this. Like, all this awful stuff happens, but it's all for the best. And it's all great, and it's all good. And even his friends and his lady being killed isn't enough to stop Candide. He still thinks it's all for the best, at least for most of the book. So, going into characters in this book, the main character is Candide. He really thinks he's smart and intelligent and well learned, but actually he's kind of an idiot and a fool, which makes him really funny to read. But also, he's not as smart as he thinks he is. He's pretty easily duped and guiled into things and kind of just goes with the flow. But I still thought he was pretty funny. We have his teacher, Pangloss, who was super intellectual. He's the philosopher who came up with this theory that everything is for the best and we're in the best possible world, despite everything telling us otherwise. Actually like Pangloss, and he shows up many times, and he's like the best friend Candide could have, so at least he's incredibly loyal. We have the lady Cunegonde, who was incredibly gorgeous and a little bit vain maybe, but also she's not terribly afraid of just taking what life gives her and trying to turn it out for the best. So she's a pretty optimistic character also, and she wants Candide. She keeps getting thrown in with all these other guys pursuing her, but she still loves Candide throughout it all, which is pretty much awesome. At least she's faithful to him. Well, faithful in her heart, even if she's not necessarily faithful otherwise, because life circumstances and men can be jerks, especially in this world. We also have Cunegonde's brother, the Baron, who is absolutely 100% against Candide marrying his sister, because she is of noble birth with a right parentage that goes back several generations, and Candide is basically a bastard and can't prove his parentage, so not good enough for his sister, even despite all the awful things that happened to her. He's like, nope, still can't do it. But at the same time, the Baron and Candide have grown up together, and they're kind of best friends, like childhood friends, but also they kind of aren't huge friends with each other anymore because of the sister thing. So that's fun. We also have this old lady who is basically a servant, and she becomes a confidant to them. She's pretty realistic. She's like, hey, all this awful stuff has happened to me. If you ask anybody else around you, they're going to tell you awful things that have happened to them. Nobody's life is perfect. Nobody's life has turned out for the best all the time. And I appreciated her realism. We also see many different other characters that Candide kind of falls into for like a short period of time while he's in this city or that city. My favorite, though, has got to be the last one that he meets, Martin, who's this philosopher who basically is like, the world sucks. And I'm like, yes, thank you for having an actual clue what is going on, basically. And even by the end of the book, Candide starts questioning whether or not everything actually turns out for the best. So Candide's adventures take him all over the place. He goes from Germany to Portugal and Spain, and eventually goes over to the New World and ends up in Brazil, I think. And eventually ends up finding the city of El Dorado before coming back to Europe and hitting France, Venice, and Constantinople. I gotta say, El Dorado was my favorite part of this book. It's the big gleaming city where everything's made out of gold and the pebbles on the street are like rubies and emeralds, and nobody thinks anything of it because they're so abundant. And everybody's great and society's awesome. Nobody's poor. Everybody's got enough food. Even the king is like this great, awesome manager type character rather than being evil dictator, which I super loved. And they're really incredibly hospitable towards Candide and the friend he has at the time. And I wanted to stay in that utopia, please. But Candide gets bored and leaves, and so even what's perfect isn't perfect because his lady's not there in the love of his life, so he leaves perfection. Candide clearly made a mistake. This is a satire, and we definitely get to see Voltaire messing around with politics and religion and slavery and money and romance and relationships, and we get to see so many different outlooks on life and perspectives and what people care about. Like, Candide comes back from El Dorado with all this money, and then we get to see everybody just trying to be friends with him just because of the money. Or several characters in this book end up in slavery at different points. And we get to see lots of religious officials, people who are supposed to be Jesuits and priests and monks, and even talking about the Pope at some point. And kind of being like, none of these religious figures are actually all that saintly and as religious and pious as they're supposed to be. Definitely attacking politics and monarchies and wars. Like, he joins the army, so we're attacking like why we fight wars and what are the consequences of that. It also looks at things like the exchange of goods between Europe and South America and really what the cost of that was, specifically talking about like sugar and chocolate, which I both really love. So it hurt to be reminded of that past. And also things like syphilis coming to the old world from the new world. So some of the revenge, but really just playing with everybody's thoughts and opinions. And by the end of this book, though, I kind of felt like nothing really mattered. Like, it doesn't really matter what you think of the world and perceive it, because life's just going to happen anyway, and this is just how you're the lens you're looking at things through. So it felt a little depressing by the end of this book. The crazy adventures got repetitive. So that also became kind of a downer by the end of the story. I do really like the last line of this book, which basically they're ending their adventures and they're stopping and they found a place and they're settling down. And despite everything that happened and everybody's philosophies and thoughts and opinions and religious beliefs getting thrown up in the air and everything, like, the very last line of this book is that we must cultivate our garden. Like, kind of just ignore everything else, and sometimes you just got to pay attention to the little things and just keep living and doing your stuff, which is kind of sweet. And I really like that last line, which I don't think spoils too much. This book was interesting. It is a really short, quick read. The chapters are super short. It's only 100 pages, lots and lots of adventures. So I do actually recommend Candide. On the whole, I gave it 3 stars, mostly because I'm like, I don't really know that I'm that passionately attached to it. But I did super enjoy most of it. Like, 60 to 70% of it was awesome. So there are my thoughts on Candide by Voltaire. Let me know in the comments below if you have read it and what you thought of it. I will link to Crash Course video on Candide if you want more of a historical background. And otherwise, I'm not going to do too much digging into it because I just didn't care. So, I mean, if you want it, it's out there, the historical perspective and what the satires are actually supposed to mean. So, peace out. I love you guys and keep reading. Bye.